Most people imagine the tabernacle as a shining tent that descended from heaven, pure, perfect, already complete. But the truth is quite different and much more human. Hidden behind the sacred curtains were men whose names were never written in Scripture. Men with scarred hands, eyes burning with smoke, fingers steady from years of practice, and a patience forged in the desert. They were the ones who melted gold until it flowed like light, who carved acacia wood so fine it vibrated under the blade, who transformed looted jewels and foreign techniques into a portable sanctuary for the God of Israel. Today, you will not only hear the story of the tabernacle, you will meet who really built it, the unseen workers of the Bible, the silent artisans who shaped the sacred. Most people imagine the tabernacle as a bright tent floating on a cloud of holiness, a simple shelter set apart by God. What they rarely see are the hands that burned, the furnaces that smoked, the hours of patient counting, the teachers who showed apprentices how to draw a straight line on soft wood and how to beat gold thin as a whisper. Prepare yourself to meet those hidden artisans, the ones who turned plundered jewelry and foreign technique into a portable house for the divine. Before we begin, if you want to follow the journey from spoil to sanctuary, stay with this account until the end, and please like and subscribe so more of these reconstructions can be brought to light. In the second year after Israel's departure from Egypt, when the cloud still moved above the camp, and the people were learning the slow grammar of freedom, Moses ascended the mountain and received a pattern. He did not receive vague counsel, but measure by measure, material by material, an instruction that named gold and acacia, fine linen and blue, tatches of porphyry and crimson. The command came as a blueprint of both holiness and craft, a dwelling to be folded and carried, an inner sanctum visible only to consecrated eyes, furniture set with names of tribes, and garments woven with imagery of cherubim. It was a project that married sacred purpose to the exacting demands of workmanship. From the spoils they had taken in haste in Egypt, necklaces, bracelets, bits of beaten gold, rolls of fine cloth, there rose the raw potential for something else. The gold that once hung idly on an Egyptian arm would be melted, purified, and remade into flame and light. Silver and bronze would answer function and form. Women who had woven in private courtyards or served in palaces now found themselves at looms with a new charge, to weave fabrics that would carry iconography and color worthy of the divine presence. Men who had hauled mud bricks learned to read a cubit and to plane an acacia board until it fit like a promise. Bezalel, son of Uri of the tribe of Judah, and Oholiab, son of Asamach of the tribe of Dan, rose as the named fulcrum of this work. Scripture says the Spirit filled them to devise and to do. The crowd saw in them not only a leader and an assistant, but two kinds of hands, one set to imagine the form, another to train the village of artisans until their motions matched the divine pattern. Bezalel carried the weight of design on his shoulders. He must translate a heavenly pattern into measures and tools to teach others how to execute when their fingers had never known such precision. Oholiab became the teacher at the bench and the loom, the one who took the weary and showed them how to keep a consistent thread tension. how to stitch a hem that would not unravel when the tent was folded and moved. They organized labor as a camp organizes itself under a dire necessity, not by modern contracts or ledgers, but by call and offering. Men and women came forward with what they could, gifts of gold, the dawning of skill. Moses set the pace. The people were to bring freely. Generosity, not compulsion, became the raw resource. Where scarcity might have bred compromise, the offering carried its own standard. The community's reverence supplied a stern quality control. Those with a craftsman's eye were gathered near the mountain. Those who could beat metal or spin thread found their place by the roar of the furnace or the clack of the shuttle. The metallurgy was a mystery to many, but to those who stood near the crucible, it was an art and a worry. Gold melts at about 1064 degrees Celsius. Simple observation warned the smiths that such heat demanded craft as much as courage. There were no enclosed brick kilns of later age, no bellows the size of a man's torso driven by water wheels. They worked with open furnaces lined with stone and clay, charcoal made from acacia, because acacia, common in the Sinai, produced a hot, steady embers when converted to charcoal. The bellows were leather cheeks, manned by pairs of men who learned to breathe fire into the furnace and keep the flame steady. The ore and the beaten plates of gold were stacked with charcoal and flux, oils and resins known to speed purification. And in the crucible, the metal gave off a smell that was both sweet and bitter, an odor that would be remembered by many who worked there, the smoke of transformation. They learned how to temper and how to hammer. Gold, alone among these metals, is malleable to the point of becoming a leaf. The menorah, by command, was to be hammered out of one piece. That required a smith whose hands could imagine negative space, who could see the hollow inside the lamp in the piece on his anvil, and coax it outward with steady, patient blows. Bronze, used for the altar and implements, was alloyed by mixing copper with a measured portion of tin, and sometimes with traces of arsenic from older techniques. It was cast into molds for large implements and worked cold when thinner shapes were required. Wood meant acacia. Text. Text-to-speech generation. They taught water conservation measures at the forges, dips of water to quench tools, careful rationing so that a cooling basin was not empty at a critical hour. Where modern projects might have relied on overseers with titles, here authority was a thing of witnessed competence. When Bezalel demonstrated a technique for annealing gold, heating then cooling it slowly to relieve internal stresses, no proclamation was required. A motion of his hand and apprenticeship began. There were disagreements and fears. Artisans whispered in the shade about whether they could meet the divine standard. Some asked if their work could ever be worthy enough. To be entrusted with a holy object brought a pressure that was at once prideful and terror-struck. Bezalel addressed such anxiety not with rebuke, but with instruction. "Hold the measure," he said once to a young smith whose hands shook. "Count the blows. Let the pattern guide the hand, not the eye alone." Oholiab, teaching a group of women the warp direction for the inner curtain, would walk along the loom, plucking a thread straight, then another, his voice low. A straight thread keeps a straight heart. They spoke in short admonitions, because long speeches were unlikely to settle trembling fingers. In the public square of the camp, Moses walked among the raw work. He inspected, he listened, he blessed. His role was not to create,
but to discern that the forms being made matched what he had seen on the mountain. At times he would stand at the entry to a workshop and ask a craftsman to show him the measure. The man, rough hands and calloused, would gesture and explain. Moses was the bridge between the divine pattern and the people's hands. In his quiet nods, the artisans found both confirmation and accountability. Logistics was a constant companion. Where did they store the gold so that thieves would not take it under the night watching? How to move bulky items across dunes and between tents? Levers, sledges, and ropes came into play. The ark, constructed of acacia and overlaid with pure gold, had poles inserted into rings so it might be borne. The poles themselves were part of the holy integrity. They remained in the rings during transport, a compromise that kept the ark mobile and intact. Smaller items found padded crates. More sizable pieces were lashed to frames and carried by teams of men with synchronized steps, the feet hitting the sand with disciplined cadence so that nothing shifted mid-journey. The community's memory of slavery shaped the tenor of the labor. Many had been accustomed to endless, repetitive toil for another's gain. Here the work, though demanding, carried a different character: freedom under discipline. Men who once bent under taskmasters now bent by choice to a task that had meaning beyond mere survival. The psychological shift was as significant as any technical training. They learned to see their labor as sacred craft.
This change was not without pain. Some nights were long with worry. Would the fabric fray? Would the gold crack? Would the people be found wanting? The leaders understood that such spiritual stakes were real. They taught steadiness like a trade. One must temper the metal and temper the people too. There were also unexpected imports of technique. Egyptians, whose years of palace craft had lingered in memory, contributed methods. Some elders recalled the technique of beating a single lamp body, a lesson passed along in snippets. How to anneal the metal at intervals to prevent cracking. How to use certain clays as molds to shape bronze for the altar's utensils. But all foreign methods were reoriented toward a new end. They were not Egyptian temples made portable, but Israelite devotion fashioned with borrowed tools. The story of the Tabernacle is, in part, the story of cultural transformation. Skills that had served imperial ornament became instruments of covenant. As the months wore, garments were finished. The ephod shone with threads of blue and gold. The robe of the ephod's hem bore a series of small bells and pomegranates embroidered between them. For the breastplate, stones were set, and a pocket, an Urim and Thummim, was prepared. The breastplate would be bound with rings to the ephod, so that when the high priest moved, the breastplate moved as a part of him. Those who sewed learned to bind so that the stitch would hold under the priest's motion, and the goldsmiths learned to file the edges of the settings until they fit like living joints. When the woven curtains were brought forth and the boards stood upright in their silver sockets, there came a collective breath. Assembly required coordination. Planks lifted in turn, staves slotted, the outer coverings drawn as a skin upon the frame. The outer tent, coarse and protective, was overlaid with the finer curtains, and then the covering of ram skins dyed red was drawn across, sealing the inner chamber from sun and sand. The assembly had an almost ritual quality. Hands moved in practiced sequence. Men uttered brief calls to steady lifts, and women arranged the interior furnishings with a reverence rarely seen outside the sacred moments of worship.
Even so, the final joining was not simply a technical triumph. It was a moment charged with fear. What if the pattern had been misread? What if some flaw, an ill-fitted board, a ring not properly closed, would render the whole unacceptable? They tested the hinges of tent and the surety of pegs, walked around the tabernacle pressing their palms to boards as if to feel a heartbeat. In whispers, they spoke of the mountain where Moses had seen the vision. The artisans looked at one another and in their private doubts lifted their work as an offering. A short scene plays in the memory of many who labored there. By the light of a small oil lamp, late, a young apprentice polished the mercy seat's golden surface.
His fingers, still raw from days of work, glided a cloth until the gold shone like a quiet river. Bezalel passed by, paused, and placed his hand on the youth's shoulder. "You have steadied your hand," he said softly. "Do not forget the measure in the small things. The hidden edge is what the eye will see at the end." The apprentice felt both chastened and honored. The touch of Bezalel anchored him. Such small transfers of affirmation kept the work from collapsing under its own pressure. As the tent approached completeness, the community prepared for dedication. The Levites were briefed on the manner of carrying, priests rehearsed movements, and the camp prepared a place before the tent to meet the cloud. They expected, but they could not fully imagine, the form the divine presence would take. The whole enterprise had been crafted under command and filled with gifts. And yet the heart of the story was not the objects themselves, but what they would hold. An encounter. Whether the glory would descend as a cloud and rest, whether the smoke would sign acceptance, these were questions that tightened the chest. The remaining tasks were small only in size. Final polish, the last stitch, a test of mobility. Ropes were checked. Poles were slipped into rings and marked with cloth so that the carriers would know how many men to assign. A rehearsal was made in which the ark was lifted and set down, the weight distributed, the walking synchronized. It was at once a maneuver and a prayer. The camp learning to move the focus of their hope without tearing it. They had transformed pillaged ornament into instruments of presence. What began as spoils of an empire had been turned, by skill and devotion and the Spirit's gifting, into a mobile house for God. The men and women who had been shaped by slavery were now shaping the divine dwelling. In the making, the people were remade. At the moment when the final curtain hung and the men withdrew to give space, the assembly ground fell into a hush. In that hush, one could hear the desert wind and the soft creak of stretched tent hides and the heartbeat of a camp waiting to know whether the labor had been accepted. The story neared its peak. The tabernacle stood. The instruments were in place. The question of acceptance lingered like a held breath. A hush spread like a garment over the camp. Even the children who had pressed at the edges of the crowd drew back, as if some instinct told them the moment had changed from human to holy. The Levites made a slow circle around the tent, their sandals whispering on sand, the rhythm of their steps measured by the memory of instruction. Priests in linen stood at the entrance. Their hands were steady, though their breaths came quick beneath the folds. The curtains trembled where the wind found seam and stitch, and for a heartbeat every eye was fixed upon the veil that hid the inner place. Moses stood apart, the pattern of the mountain still in his mind, the carved stones of law heavier in memory than any gold. He looked at the work of many hands, the boards and sockets, the rings and the breastplate that lay ready to rest upon the high priest's chest, and he bowed his head. Not for lack of courage, but for the weight of wonder. Men who had been slaves now had the courage to offer up their spoils and their skill. Women whose fingers had known knots and hems bent now to set lamps and arrange bowls. All these things were gathered into an order, and Moses remembered the command that had come at Horeb, and felt the trembling of obedience answer in the people's breasts. A fumigation of incense rose as the appointed priest took the censer within the outer court. The smoke curled upward and was caught by the first breath of the cloud. For a time, the scent and the smoke were one. Then the cloud drew more thickly, as a cloak drawn over a shoulder. It came without sound, not as a wind that breaks, but as a presence that gathers. At first it lay like a pale veil upon the mercy seat, then thickened until the golden cover was pierced no more by any eye. There was no trumpet that declared God had come. The sign was the settling of the cloud and the loss of sight. Faces were lifted and then bowed. Some hands were lifted and then stayed halfway down, for fear and for reverence met in the same joint. Bezalel, who had walked among the artisans and taught them to temper gold and to trust the measure in the small things, stood with the apprentice whose raw-fingered palms he had steadied days before. The youth wept, and the tears were not shame, but fulfillment. The metal he had filed, the stitch he had learned, were not merely craft now, but an answer. Around them old men bent like cedars of Lebanon, their voices small as dry leaves, saying nothing, but feeling the sound of the camp grow quiet as the dust. Moses drew near to the entrance, and as he entered the door of the tent, the cloud covered the tent, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. He did not go within to walk among the furniture. The cloud and the brightness were too much. He could not abide in its midst, for the scale of the presence eclipsed even the memory of the mountain's fire. So he stood at the threshold and lifted his face to the place where only a priest with heart of sacrifice could go, and there he remained, speech folded into awe. The people gathered, men and women, elders with silver upon their temples, and children with their cords of braided hair, and they fell upon their faces. Not one voice rose in song at first. Adoration was a silence that filled mouths better than any hymn. Then a trembling song began, like the first note of a lyre struck in dawn. A single voice, then another, then many. The song was not of triumph over strangers, nor of plunder won. It was the song of a people who had been taken from the house of bondage and were now to be taught to covenant. The words were at once praise and pledge. When the cloud had taken its place upon the mercy seat, and when the garments and the vessels lay appointed where they should be, a new order settled upon the camp. The pillar took its appointed services. At day it shaded them, a moving sign where men might find direction. At night it glowed like a lamp to lead their steps. Where it rested they would pitch. Where it lifted they would break camp and follow. In that manner the Lord came to dwell among them, not as a fixed habitation, but as a guide on the road. The artisans who had wrought the finer things gathered at the edge of the court. They looked upon the ark that made their labors holy, and did not boast. They spoke quietly, naming the soft detail that had most worried them, a seam, a ring, and then remembered Bezalel's hand upon the youth's shoulder, and said, "It is well, it is accepted." Old doubts that had lodged like grit in the mouths of some were washed by the vision of the cloud.
A smith who had spent nights filing gold until his eyes ached, took the gold filings from his palm and let them fall into the sand, as one laying down a burden. Aaron and his sons were consecrated by the rite they had been taught. Their garments shone, and their faces held the seriousness of those set apart. They moved with the care of men who had been given keys to a mystery. Their obedience was like an offering, not a performance. The Levites answered the call to carry and to keep, and in their service the camp found the shape of worship that must be kept if the presence was to remain unscathed. At twilight, the light of the desert made the tent's coverings seem to drink the sun. The people sat in small groups and spoke in low tones of other days, of the bricks that had been demanded, of the lash and the cry. Now their hands were marked with work they could lay before the Lord. They remembered names, ones who had sung at wells, ones who had walked with them from the house of bondage. There was grief that some had not seen this hour. There was gratitude that the design given at Sinai had found its way into wood and cloth. Moses called for law and instruction again, for presence needed not only beauty, but order. He gathered the elders and the heads of households, and made plain the ways by which the tent must be kept, the times of approach, the manners of sacrifice. His voice was neither trembling nor stern. It carried the weight of the mountain command, as one carries a lamp through the night. He spoke of faithfulness, the small acts that preserve holiness. And they listened, for they had seen that the hidden edge is what the eye would see at the end. Night came, and the pillar of fire stood as a sentinel. The camp slept in shifts, for watchfulness had become devotion.
Those who had labored longest sat in small knots by the embers and told one another stories not of conquest, but of covenant. How the God who had seen their affliction had brought them forth with a hand mighty and a purpose sure. Children slept with their heads on mothers' knees, and mothers counted not only the children before them, but the generations who would follow, imagining a people taught to bow. When the first watch gave way to the second, and the second to the dawn, a stirring moved through the camp. Men rose and prepared for what might come, some tasks for the moving of the tent, others for the keeping of the vessels, and all eyes turned toward the pillar. No man could say when it would rise. Some wondered whether they had been given only a moment of oversight. Others felt certain that the Lord would lead in ways they could not yet name. Yet both fear and hope braided themselves in the same rope, binding the people to a trust they had not chosen, but had been granted. Moses went out at daybreak and stood before the multitude. He lifted his hand not in command, but in benediction, and the camp fell into a hush deeper than any before. He spoke of journey and of obedience and of the promise that had been signed by the cloud. As the cloud moves, he said, so shall you go. As it rests, so shall you abide. Keep the ways I have told you, that the presence may continue among you. The words were simple, and yet they held the old mountain's thunder within them. Answering him, the chiefs and the Levites made ready. Ropes were coiled, staves were placed within rings, and the ark was prepared for carriage. Men adjusted their sandals and lifted not only burdens of wood and gold, but the responsibility of keeping a covenant people upon the march. Outside the circle of the tent, the camp waited, breath half held, for the sign that would set their feet in motion.
The pillar shifted as a man shifts his weight, imperceptible at first, then clear as a banner lifted on the road. Where it pointed, the people would follow. And so they stood a little straighter, gathered their belongings with steadier hands, and listened for the sound that would be the voice of direction. An unseen command translated through vapor and flame into the motion of a people made ready to walk by faith.